Thank you very much. Oops. Sorry.
Is that visible up there, the first slide? Is that your talk? Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Valeria. Now we'll have Lorenzo D'Alfonso telling us about cultic institutions, political identity, and core-periphery dynamics, rethinking the end and aftermath of the Hittite Empire. So please join me in welcoming Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Sarah and Shane. I've organized some conferences, and I know that there is normally always one of the invitees that lets you work more, and it's more difficult. I had the impression that this time I might have been that one. So I deeply apologize, and I thank you even more. It has been 6 very intense months, and we'll cope with that. Thank you very much. Okay. During the last 15 years, a renewed interest in borderlands and political and social margins have been visible in the study of ancient Western Asia and Egypt. Following the theoretical works of Monica Smith, many have challenged the existence of a physical definition of borders in pre-modern states, and sometimes even the use of and heuristic value of the concept of the state to core. Back in the 90s, Mario Liverani, in part 1 of his book Prestige and Interest, entitled Border and Territory, already stressed the segmented nature of political borders and the geographic discontinuity of borderlands. Alvise Matessi focusing on territorial discontinuity of borderlands in the late Bronze Age Al-Ala Kingdom also underscored the socioeconomic differences between each of the peripheral districts, thus delving into another aspect of borderlands, their creative, culturally lively nature, characterized by processes of synthesis and or opposition with foreign people not present in the core of political entities. Might be. Much of the work on marginal territories was generated as a reaction to the core-periphery dynamics applied by Guillermo Alkazi to the case of fourth millennium Uruk, based on Wallerstein's worst system theory. The agentive role of peripheries has become even more evident when it was possible to contrast it to few cases in which depredation and exploitation of marginal lands were investigated. The work of Parker on the transformation of the Tigris Valley as a periphery of the Assyrian Empire and the different processes ongoing in the main valley and its reorganization opposed to the exploitation of some lateral valleys allows us to have a direct grasp into opposite developments characterizing marginal lands. A perspective that I consider productive, and I see that Claudia and Alvise already talked about this, with innovative potential is one that approaches margins and margins and borderlands in a diachronic dimensions. There are at least two different aspects of the encounter between the concepts of time and borderlands that I find relevant. One that I will not discuss today considers the changes and meanings of indigenous categories defining margins and borderlands over a long time span. Today, instead, I would like to focus my talk on approaching and understanding borderlands as political actors in a diachronic perspective. Let me however, first begin with some disclaimer. So a necessary premise is needed at this point. In line with the title of this conference, margins and borders are dealt with in a socio-political perspective. Since margins are cultural constructs and derive from identities, I feel I need to specify which form of identity my talk addresses. The identity that I targeted in this paper is exclusively a large group identity. In this respect, is that it does not address individuals and minorities living at the margins within a social body, which was in fact the target of the proceedings of a conference held in '88, Außenseiter und Randgruppenbeiträge zu einer Sozialgeschichte des Alten Orients, that was published in '92 by one of my teachers, sadly recently passed away, Professor Volker Haas. Targeted in this paper is the political dimension. A second premise addressed the terminology that I use. Margin is considered synonymous with border and used in the general sense of a line or a strip around or along the edge of a geographic area. For a non-linear areal sense, I also adopt the term borderlands, as you have already heard. This definition may sound too generic in the context of political geography. Despite ambiguous, I believe with David Anthony that this neutral definition results very useful in context, far in time and space from us. There is a rich literature in English language differentiating these three concepts representing liminality in political geography, and so I refer to border, boundary, and frontier. The specific connotation of the terms were developed in the study of modern history and owe a bit depth to core-periphery political studies. The neutral use of terms such as border, margin, and borderland are a suggested retraction for over-interpretative definitions that often produce results incongruent to the reality that they are trying to explain. Let me now get back to the question of approaching political margins in a dynamic, diachronic perspective. In recent years, there has been an extensive use of resilience theory in archaeological works dealing with longue durée phenomena. Resilience is a concept adopted in ecology to indicate the ability of an ecosystem to return to its original state after being disturbed. In archaeology, its use concerned the study of the interaction between human and natural systems, whereas its adoption have mostly dealt with socio-ecological systems and mapping the trajectories of human-environmental interaction within ecosystems. The concept may also provide a promising explanatory tool to model for societal transformation in general, as Hittite has suggested. The study of socio-political systems as adaptive cycles is now at the basis of what is known as the resilience theory. Within this theory, resilience refers to a quality of a socio-political system to revert to a previous level of complexity after cycles, implying stages of release synonymic to profound crisis or collapse. In the formulation of Gunderson and Holling, the main factors defining the passage from one phase to another in the cycles are potential, intended as the quantity of energy needed to let a socio-political system function, and the connectedness, intended as the intensity and dimension of networks characterizing said system. In face of stress events, an overconnected and overpotentiated system collapses, and its new starting phase with reduced network and potential is due to the resilience proper of the system itself. Recently, Haddon and Rosen have adopted the use of resilience theory to the study of medieval Anatolia. In their methodological introduction, they propose to combine a dialectic view with a geographic one. So, this is relevant for us since marginal regions of political systems are proven less over-networked and less directly invested in the political economy of a great power. Haddon and Rosen see them as ideal resilience places within a political entity. Now, like general system theory, resilience theory has been criticized by several scholars because it leans toward environmental determinism and/or postulates recurring stages, limiting strongly the possibility of alternative outcomes and the impact of human agency. Haddon and Rosen have recently reviewed the theory identifying space for sociopolitical agency in the conservation phase, the one preceding collapse. Besides the main features of the local environment, ideological constraints, belief system, and technological knowledge are considered to have a key role in defining the passage from the conservation phase to the release one, and also defining which index of resilience characterizes a political system. Despite their model provides some space for agency of social groups, it still divides political decisions making from society, as if there were no link among the two, but only a hierarchical relation with the political sphere superimposed on the social one. This is what I was talking about, Mari, before. Now, if one instead adopts an agency-based perspective, resilience remains an intrinsic quality of an ecosystem, whereas for a socio-political system, it is better defined as the capacity of a community to cope with collapse determined by a deliberate choice aimed at the restoring the social, political, and/or cultural conditions preceding collapse by predicating the least possible effort in change. As such, resilience is the most conservative outcome of a collapse. What distinguishes socio-political systems from ecosystems is that in the former case, social actors adopt different strategies to coping with dramatic event than exclusively a resilient one. Alternative outcomes to resilience can then be defined as choices that aim at changing the socio-political structures in place before the collapse. I adopt the term reorganization to identify an outcome characterized by active revision and change within surviving institutions to partly preserve the political, social, and cultural experience preceding the collapse, but at the same time entailing significant innovative traits to help face the new conditions caused by the collapse. A third term, defining a collapse outcome from an agency-based perspective, is transformation. Transformation implies that actors surviving the collapse disregarded and deliberately abandoned the legacy of the past experience and, emphasizing change, moved towards new forms of social and political complexity. In what follows, I will try to apply my attempt to revise and propose an agency-based view of resilience theory for socio-political system to the investigation of provinces and marginal regions before and after the fall of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia. Recent contributions have provided substantial information to define the existence of borders, not outside, but inside of the late Hittite Empire. Gerczek and Matesi showed how organization and the conception of the territory of the plateau developed within the course of the second millennium. Gerczek and Matesi showed how the organization and the conception of the territory of the plateau developed within the course of the second millennium, and how Hittite texts distinguish a homeland core area roughly defined by the course of the Kızılırmak from the other adjoining regions. Moving from the distribution of four types of archaeological praxis, namely the North Central Anatolian reduced repertoire of ceramics, the settlement pattern, the administrative repertoire, and the landscape monument, Claudia Glatz produced a map that you were looking at now, showing the different degrees of interaction of different regions of the empire within the imperial network. Infrastructures such as fortifications, temples, underground granaries, and water catchment structures were a form of high-cost investment for this great power. Their distribution shows that the more symbolic and visible of these were also more spread, whereas those in a way embedded in a well-defined and intense territorial organization and political economy were instead concentrated in the core of the plateau, the homeland of Ilgi. The different territorial organization and agro-pastoral production that they required must have also produced perceived borders within the territory of the empire, taking a longue durée perspective and adopting an agentive version of the resilience theory. The end of the Hittite Empire can be seen as a phase of release caused by an extraordinary episode of several years of climatic stress, hitting on a very sensitive and unstable ecosystem. It is also caused, at the same time, by growing conflictuality within the empire. Texts present this conflictuality in the form of exasperated competition for Hittite great kingship at a very selected elite level. But clues for social instability filter through text and are narrated in the form of vandalic acts by fugitives and movable groups, particularly those resident at the margins, particularly in the northern ones. For the western, southern, and eastern regions, instead, texts present as a cause for collapse the hostile behavior of groups from the outside, labeled as the sea people, but if we go to the east, also the Sutu, the Suhu, the Tarvu, whatever they are. They have been interpreted as small groups migrating, moving in waves toward the southern portion of the territory under Hittite hegemony. But I just want to report that Dan Fleming presented in April a paper that showed how a very inhabited region like the Middle Euphrates during the end of the Late Bronze Age, all of a sudden, with the beginning of the Iron Age, becomes completely void. So this means that also local population are involved in this process as well, from my point of view. Now, in parallel to the end of other great power in world history, recent studies, if we move to the aftermath of the collapse, recent studies on early Iron Age Central Anatolia underline the existence of three cultural zones, labeled North Central, West Central, and South Central Anatolia, and representing different outcomes of the aftermath of the Hittite Empire. Despite significant differences, these outcomes juxtapose with the outcome of the upper Euphrates region, characterized by a much higher degree of continuity and resilience. More recently, Solid sets of 14C dates from Bogaskoy Buyukaya, Arslantepe, Niederkönökhöyük, and Polatlı Yassihöyük from the 4 different regions of the plateau became available, anchoring the stratigraphy, the architecture, the material culture to absolute dates, and ultimately allowing synchronization between different regions, no more dependent on a typological basis. And this is Bogaskoy and Könök you saw before Arslantepe and Yassihöyük. The general picture of the aftermath of the Hittite Empire is therefore now much strongly defined than even only 5 years ago. North Central Anatolia represents the former core of the Hittite Empire, so the homeland. After the fall of Hattusa, both the capital and the region around it moved to a much simpler form of social organization, with complete lack of urban settlement, public architecture, administrative organization, and display of symbols of power. Ceramic production rapidly changed to a handmade production, evolving but gradually diverging from shapes attested during the empire. The new excavation at Oimaach entirely confirmed this picture, and so does the recent synthesis on the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age transition at Çadırhöyük, where the exposure has been limited but extremely meaningful. So we pass from fortification walls. On top of the fortification walls, we have an early Iron Age production area, possibly associated with metallurgy, where there is, and without there and elsewhere, any clear evidence of urbanization. Excavations and surveys around Yassihöyük at Polatlı have provided the basic evidence to reconstruct the developments in western central Anatolia in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Hittite Empire. Mary Voigt and others have stressed the profound transformation taking place also in this region, with a new household-based socioeconomic structure similar to the one observed at Bogaskoy Buyukaya. The profound change is here supported also by the result of the survey around the site led by Lisa Kielhofer, which showed a strong change in settlement pattern from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. There are significant evidence in the early Iron Age materials between, there are significant difference in the early Iron Age materials between Buyukaya and Yassihöyük, mainly concerning the ceramic and metal assemblages, possibly resulting from site-specific situation and the different impact of newcomers into the two communities. What is important is that both sides, the earliest evidence of urbanism date not earlier than the late 10th, 9th century, so some 200, 250 years after the collapse. A different trajectory is observed in the Euphrates Valley and in eastern central Anatolia, so down to Carchemish. Early studies by David Hawkins reconstructed a dynastic continuity in Carchemish and Malatya attested on Anatolian hieroglyphic sources of the 12th and 11th century. The reprise of excavations at Carchemish Jarablus has begun to produce clues for continuity in the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age transition that was otherwise not investigated by Woolley. The recently published deep sounding in Area G on the western Citadel Mound shows continuity in function, very likely an open area or a court, with continuity in pebble floors in the passage from the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. It is, in fact, the fieldwork at Arslantepe in the last decade, published mainly by Manuelli and Liverani, that produced most of the new data on the Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age transition. In extreme synthesis, they show clear evidence of continuity of urban settlement, of social complexity, the adoption of Anatolian hieroglyphic writing, and the adoption of display of monumental art representing a well-codified Hittite repertoire. The new excavations produced a chronological framework for defensive architecture associated to the archaic relief of the Lion Gate of Malatya, dating it to the 12th, 11th century BCE. Among the group of archaic reliefs are those representing scenes of offering and libation of the king to the gods. The presence of these scenes at the city gates respond to a claim of dynastic legitimation that is a characteristic feature of Hittite monumental art. The same scene is represented also at Carchemish on the water gate. Let me finally come to South Central Anatolia. This continuity of toponymy and lack of Late Bronze Age destruction levels was noted by Bittel already in 1983. Continuity in settlement pattern has been recently confirmed by Alcock and Roberts for North Cappadocia and Matessi and others, here particularly in opposition to the neighboring Western Konya plain. Fresh evidence supported by solid foreseen dates have been produced in the last 9 years by the excavation at Niederkönigshöjük that I lead. In Operation A, on the northern slope of the mound, early Iron Age citadel walls were built sometimes in the 11th century directly on top of the earlier fortifications, likely dating to the Late Bronze Age. The Late Bronze Age Iron Age transition has also been explored in Operation C, Sector C3. Here, 2 large-scale silos were built sometimes after 1050 BCE along the Iron Age walls, indicating a planned infrastructural layout aimed to store significant quantities of agricultural products in close proximity to the citadel walls. To my knowledge, this is the earliest example of urban center with infrastructure in post-Hittite Central Anatolia. Similar results might now be achieved by the ongoing excavation at the site of Ovauren, near Nevşehir, so more or less in the same area. More evidence comes from monumental artworks of the region around Königshöjük. 4 monuments are likely to date to the early Iron Age. 3 of them, the 2 stelae from Tavşantepe and the Ivris rock relief number 2, feature offering scenes without libation, executed in a very schematic and low relief style. The Ivris number 2 relief is particularly important. It represents 2 standing human figures looking towards the right. The first figure, whose upper part is lost, likely represents the practitioner and/or commissioner. The second figure, shorter than the first, holds by the horns and the rear as sacrificial animal. The only parallels to this scene are the Hittite Empire Sphinx Gate at Alacahöyük and the post-Hittite early Iron Age Lion Gate at Malatya and Water Gate at Carchemish that I presented before. However, the lack of use of Anatolian hieroglyphic and the lack of a libation scene divide this monument from the other 3. Even more relevant are context and support of this relief. The offering scene is not found at the city gate, as in the previous cases from Carchemish, Malatya, Alaja, but is set in an open-air cultic context. Analyzing the outcome of the phase of release of the different regions of the empire, one can see that the region where the change had been the most abrupt and intense is the former core of the empire. The deep transformation that followed the end of the empire can be the result of climatic and military stress hitting a too rigidly organized political economy with too little margins of surplus. Against the importance credited by Holden and Rosen to cultural ideological bias, it is telling that the region of the empire that was best equipped with infrastructure for water catchment and grain storage to cope with drought was in fact the one hit most severely by the collapse. It is not clear whether the lack of resilience attested in this region is the result of human agency, a choice, or just the consequence of overwhelming circumstances. The selective fire of only the public monumental building at Hattusa and the abandonment of most of the town are clues, however, in support of a deliberate choice of not reverting to the previous socio-political situation. It is telling that even when a new fortified center is built on Hattusa in the 9th, 8th century, there is no evidence of continuity of earlier cultic places and Hittite pantheon. A similar transformation characterizes West Central Anatolia, since we have little evidence of how the region was organized in the late Bronze Age. That makes an evaluation of the specific dynamics within this marginal region during the transition a little bit fuzzier. The opposite case to the transformation attested in the former core of the empire is the continuity showed for the regions of Malatya and Carchemish on the Euphrates. Political and dynastic continuity attested in this peripheral region are indicative of a deliberate, resilient choice by local societies who face the release phase caused by distress, opting for the restoration of a situation as close as possible to the one preceding the fall of the empire. The continuity in the cult of the main deities worshipped in each city during the late Bronze Age, as well as the significance of the fortification gates as main cultic places, are evidence of endurance of the religious institution and belief system in supporting socio-political resilience in these communities at the eastern margins of the former empire. The case of South Central Anatolia shows a third type of outcome. Elements of continuity represented by toponymy, settlement pattern, and for the case of Niederknökeyuk and Ovauren, reconstruction of infrastructure circa a century after the collapse of the empire, imply that the radical transformation characterizing North Central Anatolia was not the choice operated by local peoples after the phase of release here. At the same time, the lack of the symbols of power signaling Hittite political legacy is meaningful. There is no evidence of early Iron Age Anatolian hieroglyphic inscriptions. There is no evidence of representation of kings in typical Hittite attire or performing typical activities connected with Hittite kingship. This implies a deliberate choice of distancing from the former political experience by local groups, despite retaining the former territorial and economical organization. The presence of monumental art signaling open-air cultic places outside of urban space that were likely traditional and therefore attended by local community from early times may suggest that the local system of beliefs and religious institutions had a relevant role in shaping the reorganization taking place in the region, while the communities were not politically resilient in regard to the legacy of the Hittite Empire. Let me conclude. A revised version of resilience theory, envisioning resilience as a choice of a community rather than an imminent feature of a system, better fit the case study of the collapse of the Hittite Empire than the traditional one. It allows us to understand the political dynamics in place in the peripheries and the different peripheral trajectories. The impact of a belief system in biasing an efficient response to powerful distress suggested by Haldane and Rosen might work for canonized religions, but is hardly applicable to earlier belief systems that left a lot of space to multiple interpretation of each phenomenon. At least it is fully disproved by the different outcomes associated with the agency that religious institution and belief system would play in the different marginal regions we considered. By contrast, the case of the Hittite Empire confirms that peripheries cope with distress with a higher degree of resilience than the core of a big power. As implied by resilience theory, potential and connectedness are likely to play a decisive role in promoting the release phase. We lack the evidence from economic texts in the Hittite Empire, but the case of the land of Hatti proper, where big infrastructure against drought were constructed and nonetheless were not sufficient to overcome the crisis, is better explained by the exceeding potential of the economic system in the region. In parallel, the discontinuity in the cult may depend on the excessive interconnection of religious institution with political and economic system. A major distance of this institution from the Hittite power might have characterized the peripheral regions. However, connectiveness over networking as a bias against appropriate social response to distress might derive more from our current Western mainstream liberalism than from the actual evidence at hand. High connectedness may offer both advantages and disadvantages in distress situations. Based on the study of material culture, Federico Manuelli has shown that Malatya had a very rich network of relations within the Hittite Empire that excluded the core of the empire without being in competition with it. No less interconnected was Late Bronze Age Carchemish, and nonetheless, both expressed the most resilient attitude after the collapse of the Hittite Empire. I would conclude that despite connectedness might have played a role in resilience theory cycle, its impact may be secondary and more subjective to political choice than potential. The latter, together with local histories, is suggested to be the main feature producing a divide between the core and the lands at the margins of the Hittite Empire at the time of its demise. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorenzo. I'll invite Valeria back up to the front, and we have time for questions and discussion. You'll go first. Sorry, I have to say this. I have to remember the thing I have to say. It can be difficult for people on the live stream to hear the questions, so I just need to remind our speakers and audience members to kind of summarize the question before you answer it. Okay.
I have a question for Lorenzo, and thank you for this very thought-provoking paper. I have a question, and that is, I'd like to ask your opinion about this. When you say that the peripheries prove to be more resilient, especially when we're thinking about the South Central region and the East Central region, and particularly in the Empire period and later towards the Iron Age. Should we reconsider whether this region was still peripheral or whether the core of Hatti, despite how our texts present it as the homeland in the north, whether the core itself was shifting southward, so that these regions were not really peripheral in the end, but the capital up north ended up being peripheral. And I'm not only thinking about that whole experiment with moving the capital to the south, and well, not just that, but when you think of it in cultural terms too, and how strong this region was in defining the later imperial culture as well. So this is something I'm struggling with, and
So thank you very much for this question, Ilgi. The question that Ilgi asks is whether we can define regions such. I'm not able to get there. Back. Okay, let's stay here. If we can define regions just like South Central Anatolia and East Central Anatolia as peripheries. Now, there are the question is not easy to answer because it depends from which point of view you look at that. So and this once again, I could answer diachronically, and we both know that there has been an attempt to make the South Central Anatolia the center, and that didn't work. So also that has been matter of decision, what was kept the core or not. I refer to an early 13th century attempt to change the capital and move it to the south. That was the case of the usurpation and many of the problems that we talk about. What I can tell you is that I really took very at heart the work that Claudia has done. Because that is a work that for the first time, after 100 years of Hittitology, allowed us to look at this problem without text, so putting text aside and having a look at what we have as evidence, and then getting back to the text. So I think that if you look at those results and what material culture tells us, and if you look at other proxies, so I brought in, for example, infrastructure, that is also, you don't see those infrastructures in these other regions. You see them in the core. I think that, and this is circular, so I buy that. The different outcome also might say something in connection with what we see before with this evidence. Now, what you're saying, it is particularly important from a cultural point of view. You know that Jeff Summers has published 2017 a paper in which he suggests that all what we get of Hittite legacy in Anatolia is reintroduced from the south in the 9th, 8th century. What I was trying to show is that no, there is some genuinely local continuity, but it has specific features, and it is very much true that many elements come back from the south, and so Nathan is studying some of them, for example, looking at the storm god of the vineyard and so on. I hope I answered your question.
Claudia?
Thank you very much for your really interesting talk. I've also been grappling with this idea of collapse and what happens afterwards lately, and I can see that the idea of resilience offers an interesting framework to think about these problems and how we interpret what happens afterwards. I'm just wondering whether when you work under the assumption that that it has this strong agency component to it, that it's people's choice to collapse or not to collapse. I wonder if you think about kind of the new materialism debate and how tied into the material world that we are with dependencies on creating monumental architecture, in keeping administrative structures alive, these are not so easy choices to make when some of your key components might be removed, some of your relationships, some of these connections are removed in that process of decline or ultimately collapse. In the same way with the resilience, how easy is it to choose not to collapse? I wondered if you had any more thoughts on that.
The question of Claudia was how is it really possible to talk about agency of a society and against resilience, so to say, embracing collapse. There is some provocative part in what I, of course, tried. So this revised application. Let's put it like that. When I started to read about resilience, I think all of us, so it's a new theory in the field, you start reading, you're getting interested and so on. I really immediately got disturbed by how it looked deterministic. So there was no move if you are in that situation. And my first reaction is, and let's take the case of Hattusa. Yes, it is possible that there was nothing to do in that situation. There was really nothing to do. What I do not accept is that the situation as Hattusa is described with the adjective resilient as the one in Carchemish, as the one at Canuck. Because if we really do the work you have done, and we look at what we see on the ground, we see the most different. So you have made the slice in the late Bronze Age, and you had some differences. What I was trying to show is that if you do the same slice 100 years later, you see really peaks and valleys depending, so moving 200 kilometers apart. My provocative philosophical point is here, a plant in front of distress doesn't have choice. Either it is equipped in the system, in the ecosystem it stays in to survive, or it doesn't, full stop. Men can choose. They can choose that in front of the highest level of distress, they abandon everything and go away. I would not call that resilience. The system is not resilient at all. So, and in many of this, if you go back at the whole introduction of Yasser Lindau about migration, the many of push and pull factors that you see there, they split a community. And you would have community that choose to go, and community that may choose to stay. I wanted just to put an emphasis to try to see what happens if we do that. Whether this is a good model or not, I'm not sure. I'm open to.
I think we have time for probably one more question. Or we can get some coffee. Okay, how about some coffee? So coffee will be just back there where the food was. Thank you very much. Sorry. I prepared a question.
I was actually going to ask you something, but there wasn't enough time to like formulate.
It was just so
No, it's okay.
You can just ramble.
I guess people
I don't
do
really
that.
have a question here, but like I want to